Hi everyone, and welcome to the final video in our series of how to build your sampling instrument in Max. So at this point we've got the various elements of our Max instrument. We just need to make everything work and make everything work together. So far we've covered, we know how to use a buffer to store an audio file and how to play it back. We know how to control audio signals. We can speed up files, we can change the gain of them. We've covered how to build a simple delay effect. We know how to connect a MIDI instrument and how to use that to trigger and to control samples. But what we need to think about now is we need to think about putting the whole instrument together. We need to think about a way of making this a usable instrument. So we're going to cover two things in this video. First of all, we're going to look at how to deal with a batch of samples, a sample bank, and how to load them quickly. And then we're going to look at we're going to look at the visual layout of the instrument, and how the kind of user interface changes how we can use the instrument and how we can kind of play it. Okay, so you might have something that looks a little bit like this at this point. You might have something that's a whole lot messier, and you might have something that's a whole lot cleaner. But let's start with this as a kind of familiar territory. So we know that we've got a way of receiving audio from wherever we've sent it. We've looked at that. We've got a sort of system to mix our main outputs, and we can control the gain and send it to the main audio outputs. In one of the first videos, we also made a little delay effect that we've got that plugged in here. And in the last couple of videos, we looked at MIDI mapping. So we have a system that can take a keyboard and it can trigger a bunch of samples. So we could just hook these up to a sample if we wanted and trigger them. Now, if we think back to our first video, we have this buffer, right? So we have a place where we can store an audio file, and then when we say, hey, I need that audio file, we can call it and play it out of this buffer with this groove object. We just hit this button and it plays it out. So I can open the buffer, we can check it here, it's the same as this. It's called a waveform object. We can change the pitch of it if we want to. Remember, if I say half the speed, that's going to take the octave down. Back up. So we know how to do that. We also looked at panning randomly. So every time we trigger a new sample, this little random object is going to create a new number from 0 to 127, and that's going to pan a sound from left to right. So all of this, while it might have been a little while since you patched it up, this should be kind of familiar territory. So what we want to think about now is, how can we make this helpful? How can we make this not a complete pain to use when we're working with a bank of samples? Because at the moment, the easiest way to kind of work with a whole bank of samples, say we want 12 samples or 24 samples, is to kind of copy and paste this, and then we have to create a new buffer. We have to rename that buffer 2, and then we need another copy of this, and it's kind of a pain. And you can see how this multiplied by 12 would get very messy very quickly. So we need to think of a more efficient way of working with it. We need to think of a way that is a bit cleaner, and because when we have clean code, it makes it a little bit easier to find our way around. So we're going to step through a few points to make this a little bit more usable, to make this a little bit more user-friendly. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to encapsulate a bunch of stuff that we don't need. We already looked at encapsulation, but essentially I'm going to take some elements that we don't need to see all the time, and I'm going to hide them in a sub patch. I'm going to hide them in a folder, essentially. So that's Command, Shift, and E. And I've taken all of those non-essential elements, and I've only left the kind of important bits, which is the trigger, the playback pitch, and these send objects, because we need these to be in the same window so that they know that they're talking to each other. You might find that you need to kind of save and reopen your max patch a few times when you do when you're working with buffers and things, because sometimes the buffer won't initialize straight away. That's what I've had to do here, and you'll hear that I've in fact I'm gonna have to do it again. And there we go, I've got the clap sample playing now. So we've got rid of all of these kind of non-essential things, and they're just sitting in their own little folder down here now. So I can give this a helpful name so that we know what it is. It's a playback buffer. And now I can just have these two things kind of sat together neatly, and that's helpful. But again, if we start to if we copy this a few times, and have to change the name because otherwise they're the same buffer. This needs to become buffer 2. This needs to get groove buffer 2 in there. We need to change the buffer window. It all gets very confusing very quickly. So what we're going to think about is dragging and dropping a whole bunch of samples. So you'll see that I've got a whole folder here. This is my max patch and these are my samples. So let's just make this a little bit more easy to follow. I'm going to have a folder here called samples that all of my samples are going to sit in. But whenever I load this max patch, I don't want to have to just sit there and drag each of the samples into the buffer, because if we're working with 12 samples, I have to do it 12 times. If we're doing it 24 samples, it becomes very tedious very quickly. So we're going to look at creating a drag and drop system in Max. Now, this is going to use a few kind of, not complicated, but a few unexpected objects. So what I would suggest is you kind of just patch along with this, and don't worry too much if some things come up that you're not completely sure about. This is going to be a little tricky, but if we get it done, it's going to make your instruments a whole lot easier to use and a whole lot simpler to work with. So we're going to create a new object. The object is the drop file, creatively named because we're going to be dragging and dropping files onto it. So what we can do here, I'm sure you've used drag and drop in kind of software or programs before, but essentially this will allow us to take a file or a number of files, drag it on, and then it will give us the path name, the file name, the location, or whatever. So what we're gonna do here is, just because this is a bit innocuous to spot, we're gonna create a little comment here just to say drop a selection of samples here. Because we don't want to just have to do this with one sample, we want to be able to drag all of our samples at once. And so I can just hover that over the center, and it just means that we know. It's a little reminder for the user interface. So what we need to do now is we're going to create a bunch of objects to essentially unpack a list of samples. So I'm going to say, let's work under the assumption at the moment that we're going to be working with a bank of 12 samples. So I'm going to put in 12 here in a counter object. Don't worry too much about following kind of what's going on here, but essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to say run through a list of 12 numbers, our 12 files, and replace the name with the kind of number of the buffer. So I'm going to go root, and I just need to go very quickly from 1 to 12. There we go. So what's going to happen now is it's going to take each of the 12 files that I drop on it, and it's going to output the file name to one of these, which we can, if we create a new buffer object, remember that we need to give it a buffer name. So I'm going to call this buffer 01. We give it a duration, and in this case we don't know what the duration is going to be, so I'm going to say -1, and that's basically going to say just any duration of the file length. And then we need to decide if it's mono or if it's stereo. In this instance I'm just going to work with mono files, but if you're working with stereo that would be 2, but for now I'm just going to put one file, and it's mono. And then a nice little kind of user interface thing, I guess. I'm going to add a little waveform here. I'm going to make it small so it's kind of out of the way. I'm just going to put it next to it. And then remember that we need to change the name of the waveform. We need to give it the buffer name. So I'm going to call it buffer01 to match our buffer object. And you'll see that now it knows what's in the buffer. This is a copy of that up there. So actually I can get rid of this now. There we go. So I will then take this, and this is buffer1. Now I'm going to quickly run through and do this for all 12. It's a little tedious to do now. It's going to take a couple of minutes, but it's important because it will save us a lot of time and hassle in the long run. So I'm just going to run through that now. Okay, only a couple more things to quickly do. First of all is to clean those up. Second of all, we just need to patch the outlet of this, the S portion to the S here. And then what we need to do is we need to tell the drop file what kind of files we want. So I'm going to open the inspector, Command I, and then this matching files, I'm going to add in all caps, I'm just going to say AIFF, all caps, AIFF, we're going to take WAV files, and we're going to take MPEGs. So these are the types of audio files that it will accept if we need it to. And then I can take the audio files that I've got here. So I've got 12 audio samples, and I can drag them on, and we'll see they've now filled these 12 buffers. So that method, although it was a little time consuming to build at first, is a lot quicker than having to load 12 or 24 or however many individual waveforms. Now we can start to think about making copies of this in a way that makes sense for us to use. So now that we've got a bank of 12 buffers and we've got our various samples loaded into those buffers, it's just a matter of taking this and making 12 copies of it. The one thing you have to remember though is that you have to go into our little playback and you just need to change the number of the buffer so that it's synced up to the right, the correct buffer. Since we've got the buffer windows, what we can do is we can make copies of them if we want. So this, we can just see buffer 1. We could also do something like add a meter, which is a nice little effect. So let's just monitor the left channel just to see if something's coming out. I suppose we should probably sum them, left and right. So now when we trigger it, we get to see the output just so that we know it's happening, and we could do the same with the waveform. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to run through. I'm going to make 12 copies of these and remember to rename the buffers. Okay, I made it. It was a little tedious, but we got there in the end. I've now got 12 copies of the buffer, the playback system that we put together. I've got a drag and drop system so I can load a whole bunch of samples, and I've got them all hooked up. And you can see I just hook it up to my keyboard here. Hey, there we go. Okay, so we've got our sampler. It works. It does the thing that we set out to do. Now, arguably, there is one more thing. This is a mess. This is horrible. This is not musical. This doesn't mean anything. Oh, it's ghastly. We need to fix this. So, luckily, don't worry, I see everyone head in hands. There can't be more to do. This is only a tiny thing. Max has a really handy feature called presentation mode. And presentation mode essentially allows us to hide all of the ghastly bits. We don't need patch cables, we don't need weird root objects and buffers. We don't need to see any of that because we're musicians and we just want a nice instrument in front of us. We want a panel, something simple, something that we can use. So how do we do that? Well, all we have to do is we find the bits that we want. So I want this keyboard, I want these, There are some other things that I want. I want my delay stuff. I want my main output things. It'd be nice to have the meters. So I just select all of those and I right click and then I say add to presentation. And what does that do? Well, I'm sure you've been wondering what this little icon in the bottom left hand corner of your screen does. Is presentation mode. If we go ahead and click this now, oh yeah, it's hidden everything that I didn't select just now, and it's just given me those parts that I have. So this is, this is better. It's not particularly usable at the moment, but we can see how this can work. Now, one of the things that you'll note is I'm just moving stuff around now. There's no patch cables, and you might be asking, Oliver, this is making a mess of your beautiful Max patch behind the scenes, as it were, under the bonnet. And to that, I can thankfully say, don't worry, it's not. So if we head back into the main out of presentation mode, back into patching mode, everything's where I left it. Fantastic. So these two views are completely unrelated. So we can do all kinds of things. We can move everything nice and close together, and everything still works. And we've just got the information that we need, and we've hidden everything else that we don't. Now, I would say a couple things. I would say I don't really know what these are. So it's helpful to add a little comment just to say sample 1, and I could add all of those for the other elements, and I can say what the keyboard is. The keyboard is a bit self-explanatory, but I can move these together. There's a nice little feature, a nice little trick that we can do for everyone that wants to make this real pretty. We can add a panel object. A panel is just a colored panel, really. But it can be helpful from a kind of user interface perspective, because it allows us to separate things. So I can say that everything that is yellow is related to our output, to our audio output. I just send it to the back, and then I can make another one that's just to do with all of the sampling bits, the bits that the user wants to play, and they're all going to be green, yellow, green. There we go. And I right click that and I send it to the back. See? Excellent. The one thing I've missed here is our drag and drop that we so laboriously created. Add to presentation. Head back into presentation. There it is. I can move it up. So we've got our user can drag and drop some folders here. Okay, and this is a nice one. We can just play around with this and figure out how the user can interact with it. What can they do? How would you want to play this as a musician? You'd want the keyboard somewhere easy to see. You want the buttons kind of close together so that if you're playing with a mouse, they're not too bad to play around with. It might be nice to see the waveforms of the samples, so we could put those in. Play around with our delay, so that's near the volume. Makes sense to keep the on-off button near the switch. There are a couple other things that we could do. So I'm gonna, in a kind of very organized moment, I'm gonna now switch to one that I made earlier, and here it is. So you see here that I've got a section up here for loading the samples. I've got a section for playing around with the settings, so I can change the pitch of the settings and I can see them. I've got a little section here where I can trigger the samples or play them in on my MIDI keyboard. I've got my delay that I can play around with the speed and the feedback and things like that. You'll also see that a handy little feature that I've got is that I've got these little labels, and they tell the user how to go about using it. So if I go here and select, they're just comments, and then I turn this bubble feature on, and that's how I get that. So it's a nice little way of kind of walking the user through. So number one, first thing to do, turn on audio. I seem to have two things called 3. Let's call that 2. Number 2, set your level, set your delay. My numbering system is all bad here. Number 2 is load my samples, my drag and drop system, and I can see when they're loaded, I can see the waveforms. 4, set the delay, and then 5, finally trigger samples. This is, maybe my color scheme is a little garish, but the point is that it allows the user to very quickly distinguish what is doing what. These two sections are both green, they're related. These sections are next to each other, we can use them simultaneously, or to set our kind of finer level. Both of these are related to triggering our samples and things like that. So there we have it. A few videos. It's a little complicated, so don't worry. Max has a reputation for being complex. So don't worry if there are points where you feel a little overwhelmed by everything. Just patch through with me with these videos, and hopefully everything will make sense. And you're working in groups for this project, so feel free to ask your group if you're getting stuck on one a little bit. Having a fresh pair of eyes is always important. One of the things that you'll no doubt have realized by now about Max is that you can spend quite a while with something not working, only to realize that it was a very minor problem. There was a full stop in the wrong place. There wasn't a space where there was meant to be, or you'd spelt samples wrong, which I seem to do all the time. These tiny little problems. I've been using Max for 10 years now, and I still make the same silly mistakes that I will spend an hour staring blankly at, and then finally I get it. That's something that we kind of can't really avoid, but however, that doesn't detract from Max's usefulness, and kind of learning some of these fundamental skills becomes really, really important when there are things that you want to do, you're not really sure how to do it. Just stepping through and treating a problem in the way that we've approached it here, kind of like Lego blocks, building things up. That's a really valuable skill, and I hope that's something that you take away from your time in Max. I will leave you now with, I assume you were all wondering what the big button is. This is the grand reveal. It's been a pleasure. Have fun with Max.